Story 1. Lindy Chamberlain. A dingo actually did eat her baby, but no one believed her. She was destroyed in the media and then convicted of murder over it. Story 2. Ryan White, the poor kid who got acquired immune deficiency syndrome from a blood transfusion when he was a teenager in the 1980s. They tried keeping him out of school and made him eat school lunch by himself using throwaway trays and plastic spoons and forks. He didn't deserve any of the treatment they gave him. Story 3. The Star Wars kid recorded a video in the school studio, and a classmate found the tape and uploaded it to the internet. He had to leave school for a while because of the bullying he received both online and in person. He reportedly lost friends due to the ordeal and had to undergo psychiatric care. Story 4. Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician and scientist, described as the savior of mothers. He proposed the practice of washing hands with chlorinated lime solutions in 1847 while working in Vienna General Hospital's first obstetrical clinic, where doctors' wards had 3 times the mortality of midwives' wards. Some doctors were offended at the suggestion that they should wash their hands and mocked him for it. In 1865, he allegedly suffered a nervous breakdown and was committed to an asylum by his colleagues. In the asylum, he was beaten by the guards. He died 14 days later from a gangrenous wound on his right hand that may have been caused by the beating. His findings earned widespread acceptance only years after his death when Louis Pasteur confirmed the germ theory. Story 5. The lady who sued McDonald's after she spilled her coffee in her lap had a serious case. That coffee was on the verge of boiling because they wanted to go as long as possible without making a new pot. She needed reconstructive surgery on her burns because the skin basically melted together. Story 6. Robert Pattinson during the Twilight era. He got so much hate just for playing a role in a franchise he didn't even like, and now everyone is realizing how talented he actually is. The guy has been putting out amazing performances for years, and people are finally catching up. Story 7. Ulysses S. Grant was a fantastic general who outsmarted Lee at almost every stage. As a president, he arguably advocated for black rights more than any president and ruthlessly ran the Ku Klux Klan into hiding. The man had scandals that were present long before his presidency, like the credit mobilier, which started under Lincoln. He also had an issue with alcohol that he admirably fought hard to overcome for his family to stay sober. Lost 'cause talking points run deep, though over 150 years deep. Story 8. Steve Bartman. Dude was the nicest and most pure Chicago Cubs fan in the stadium. What he got from the media and fans that night and in the ensuing weeks and years was horrendous. Borderline criminal from some of the media. What validates his class is the fact that he has been offered millions over the years for interviews and appearances and has politely said no. He just wants to enjoy his baseball team. Story 9. J. Bruce Ismay, survivor of the Titanic disaster and widely criticized for it. In films about the sinking, he is portrayed as exerting pressure on Captain Smith to speed up the Titanic despite warnings of ice along the ship's route. There is no proof of this, however. Ismay was overheard talking to Smith about the ship getting into New York a day earlier, but this was merely him enthusing about how well the ship was performing on her maiden voyage. During the sinking, he walked about the decks helping passengers into lifeboats, though at least twice that night he was reprimanded by 2 of the ship's officers for interfering. First-class passenger Edith Rosenbaum remembered Ismay grabbing her by the arm, dragging her down a flight of stairs, and handing her off to some crewmen loading a lifeboat on Titanic's promenade deck. As for Ismay himself, he remained on the ship up until the last 20 minutes of the sinking, stepping into collapsible lifeboat C just before it was lowered at 2 a.m. After reaching the rescue ship Carpathia, he was so shaken and traumatized that he was ushered to a cabin and remained there until the ship docked in New York. Sadly, much of the animosity toward Ismay came from newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst. Years before, Hearst had offered Ismay a position in his media empire, but Ismay turned it down because he was not a fan of the press and went to great lengths to avoid it. Consequently, Hearst held a grudge over this snub, and upon finding out Ismay was among the survivors, decided to act on it. Story 10. Oedipus. He didn't know it was his mother until after he had slept with her. Then he blinded himself because he was so disgusted by what he had done. But thanks to Sigmund Freud, Everyone associates him with wanting to be with your mother. Not fair, I always felt bad for him. Story 11. Pee Wee Herman. A guy was caught inappropriately in an adult theater. If a celebrity did that today, it would be out of the news cycle in about a week, and I really don't think the public would care. Story 12. I don't know who all remembers the Terry Schiavo case, but the public was awful to a man who just wanted to exercise his wife's wishes and let her go in peace. Story 13. Sinead O'Connor's music career essentially declined because she spoke against the Catholic Church for all the molestations. I think that should be the top answer if it's not already. Story 14. Hayden Christensen. I'm so happy the Star Wars community has welcomed him back in recent years, but my God, he absolutely didn't deserve the hate he got in the first place. Story 15. There are so many wildly problematic content creators that still have an active platform, while Jenna was torn down over a decade-old video after proving for years that she grew as a person and saw her actions as wrong. Story 16. Britney Spears. I know those videos of her dancing in her home can seem cringe, but I think it's just something she's going through, perhaps a mental struggle we don't know about. The comments on her videos are usually very mean. Also, making fun of Jean-Claude Van Damme for being a corny actor. He's not a native English speaker and apparently taught himself, starting out by watching the Flintstones a lot. It's not easy to be successful when you don't have the native accent. He also had a problem with drugs at some point, which is another huge obstacle for people to overcome. Story 17. Richard Jewell. The pain of being the prime suspect for the Atlanta Olympics bombing for months and months he endured when he actually saved lives. They dropped the investigation, but the media had done its damage. Neither the media nor the police ever apologized to him. Story 18. A dingo ate my baby. Parents of Azaria were ridiculed and hounded by the press, and the grieving mother's statement became a pop culture reference. They were accused of murdering their child. Many years later, it was finally proven that a dingo had, in fact, eaten their baby. Story 19. Stella Liebeck, also known as the lady who sued McDonald's over hot coffee, faced ridicule as people assumed she was just out for money. In reality, the poor woman suffered severe third-degree burns and required numerous painful skin grafts because McDonald's knowingly served their coffee at a dangerously high temperature. She only wanted money for the medical expenses, and McDonald's essentially refused to accept any blame until a court forced them to. Story 20. Oh, no one hates her now, not this generation. But back then it was at best considered poor taste. Otherwise, for most people, she may as well have murdered the Pope and the office of the Pope herself. Her career fell off. If the term martyr means witness, then she is our martyr. Edit. For some history buffs, Wang Mang of the Xian dynasty. You can consider him a proto-socialism ruler. Story 21. Gay men with AIDS in the 1980s were ostracized, harassed, evicted, and fired from their jobs because people believed paranoia over science and thought they were contagious. Conservatives said they were asking for it because they hated gay sex and felt it was God's way of punishing them. Story 22. The hot coffee McDonald's lady. The story that I had heard and believed for years was that some woman burnt her tongue a little and sued McDonald's for not marking clearly that their coffee was hot. When the reality was that McDonald's raised the temperature of their coffee way higher than normal, it spilled on her when getting it in the drive-thru, and her burns were horrifically severe and she needed skin grafts. She was suing for so much because it was literally how much her medical bills cost. But so many people ridiculed her and the case for years. Story 23. He was right, he tried to be completely genial and reasonable about it, but people hated someone pointing out the elephant in the room. Not to mention that without the 2000 election vote counting interference, we might have averted the worst timeline. Story 24. Rebecca Black got roasted hard at 14 years old for the song Friday. Patrice Wilson was the producer and got paid by both Black's mom and a good chunk of the proceeds, but he flew under the radar from the abuse. Granted, it's a dumb song, but the hatred was immense for a 14-year-old kid. Story 25. The lady who spilled McDonald's coffee in her lap and severely burned herself was portrayed as foolish by the media and McDonald's. It turns out that this particular McDonald's was heating its coffee beyond a reasonable temperature, and she suffered very serious burns. Story 26. Al Franken stepped down immediately and took responsibility for everything, even when what he was accused of was a staged picture. Complete nonsense. Story 27. Anthony Fauci. Imagine spending years devoted to studying medicine and earning the respect of your peers, and then you start getting death threats because a bunch of high school dropouts burned out their last functioning brain cells on the right-wing hate machine. Story 28. Richard Jewell, the security guard who was blamed for the bombing at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. He was criticized in the press and pursued by police. He was innocent and was simply doing his job. Story 29. Janet Jackson. Her career was torpedoed for her wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl, while Justin Timberlake, who ripped her top off, went completely unscathed. Story 30. Barry Manilow. Once it became popular to ridicule and hate on him, he never again approached the fame he once had. Whether or not you like his entire catalog of music or his singing style, there is no denying that he had talent. Story 31. Richard Jewell noticed a bomb at Centennial Park during the 1996 Olympics and alerted the police and crowd, allowing countless people to be saved from death or injury. He was investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as the suspect, and then the media focused on him being the culprit, but he was actually innocent. Story 32. Nickelback. They had the audacity to be a successful band not bothering anyone, except people who for some reason couldn't grasp the concept of, just don't listen if you don't like them. Story 33. Stella Liebeck was accidentally burned by McDonald's coffee that was so hot it instantly burned the skin off her labia and inner thighs. All she asked for was $20,000 so her medical bills would be covered. Instead, the powerful fast food corporation refused, offering a mere $800. She went to court and won, but the media at the time made a joke of the whole thing. They sold the idea that Liebeck was a money-hungry person and made her a laughingstock. Lawmakers seized on the case and further smeared her reputation, claiming her case was frivolous and a justification for tort reform. Story 34. The elderly lady who sued McDonald's after suffering horrific burns to her thighs and labia. McDonald's public relations team absolutely vilified that poor woman, and all she originally wanted was her medical bills covered. McDonald's refused and publicly humiliated her. Story 35. Stella Liebeck. McDonald's coffee severely burned her, resulting in her needing skin grafts. She initially asked McDonald's to cover the medical costs, but they started a smear campaign, leading her to sue. They should have, first, not served the coffee at a scalding temperature, and second, paid her hospital bill, which was around $150,000. A jury awarded her more than that amount, plus a couple of million in punitive damages for the smear campaign. Story 36. I'm probably going to get negatively criticized for this. Anita Sarkeesian. At her absolute worst, she was a low-tier influencer. At her best, she spoke a message of being critical of the media that you consume. She didn't deserve the hate she got. And we are still seeing the consequences of the hate mob that made that woman's life an anxiety-inducing nightmare. In hindsight, everything involving Gamergate seems quaint and completely irrelevant. But it ended up radicalizing a whole generation of young men into the most insufferable people imaginable. Story 37. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain before World War II broke out, is often criticized for his failure to stop Hitler by giving in to appeasement. This part he did, and it gets heavily publicized and portrays him in a bad light. What many fail to realize is that he was trying desperately to stall for time. After World War I, Britain wasn't ready for another massive war. Germany rebuilt their army and air force in secret, so when they were unveiled, there was a chorus of concern across Europe. Britain was no different. Their population suffered horrific losses. Entire village populations of young men vanished. It wasn't solely a lack of equipment. Public opinion was heavily against another big war. Everyone remembered the brutal fighting in World War I, and they weren't eager to jump right back into it. They also didn't keep their army, navy, air force, or armor divisions nearly as large as during World War I. Chamberlain started moving the ball in that direction. And even then, by the time the war started, Britain was struggling heavily for a while. They didn't have enough ships to escort their merchant fleet, and they were constantly scraping by with whatever aircraft they could get back in the air until the Blitz. where they eventually gained the upper hand. When Chamberlain resigned, Winston Churchill took over, and his different approach to the Nazis is what brings him a lot of prestige and fame when discussing the topic of World War II. But he wouldn't have been able to do it without the preparations that Chamberlain started making. Story 38. The Jar Jar Binks guy did an amazing job. His character wasn't great, and he put his whole self into it. It sucks he doesn't get any type of recognition. Story 39. Vietnam soldiers and draft dodgers. They dodged the draft because they just wanted to survive and not fight in a pointless war and risk the deadly attacks by the Viet Cong, and people felt they were cowards over it. Whereas those who did serve were ostracized, harassed, and called baby killers. Story 40. Any woman in the media who has been womaned. Anne Hathaway, Jennifer Lawrence, Amber Heard, Taylor Swift. I'm not saying she's beyond critique, but that whole snake thing on Twitter because of Kim Kardashian was dumb as hell, etc.